She counted the banknotes one by one on the table of the notary's office, with her hands trembling and her 7-month pregnant belly touching the edge of the wood. The notary looked at her over his glasses, looked at the money, looked at her belly, and asked if she was sure. Agneta said yes. She signed the document with the decisive handwriting of someone who had already made that decision long before that moment. She walked out of the office with a property deed in her dress pocket and not a single person in the world waiting for her. She took the leather suitcase that was leaning against the wall, put her summer hat on her head, and set off on foot along the dirt road toward a place she had never seen, which she knew only from the description of a stranger, and for its price, which was too low to be anything good. She had bought a ruined Torpcroft with everything she had put aside in years of hidden work, and now she was going there pregnant and alone without even knowing how to plant a single seed. If you have ever had to start from scratch, if you have ever looked ahead without seeing any path, comment below where you are watching from. Write your city and your region, because this story is made to reach where people need it. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. In the rural Sweden of yesteryear, tales like this echoed among rivers and gravel roads. Agneta was 30 years old and carried with her that kind of weariness that does not come from the body, but from always living in the space left over by others. Her mother, Fru Signy, was a washerwoman by profession and a woman of silent strength, the kind who wakes up before the sun and stops only when her hands can no longer wring the clothes. She washed clothes for 5 families in the village and raised her daughter alone because Agneta's father was a name that had never been spoken in that house, an absence so ancient that it no longer hurt. It simply existed like a hole in the wall that no one bothered to plaster. Agneta grew up among basins of clothes, pine tar, soap, and the smell of bluing agent that remained impregnated in her mother's hands, and which for many years was the smell of safety for her. Fru Signy died when Agneta was 14 years old. She died, as women died at that time, of a fever that started weak and grew stronger and stronger, without a doctor nearby who could make a difference, without money for medicine that perhaps would have. Agneta stayed by her side during the last 3 days, changing the rags on her forehead and boiling the herbal tea that a neighbor brought in the morning with an expression on her face that said more than words could express. On the 4th day, Fru Signy squeezed her daughter's hand with a strength that did not suit her consumed body, and said with a voice that barely came out that Agneta must learn to keep. "Keep what?" asked the girl. "Everything," said her mother. "Everything that is yours, keep it." Those were the last words Agneta heard from her, and they stuck to her like a brand burned into leather. From the age of 14, Agneta became a maid, not because she chose to, but because the alternative was the street. And the street was not an alternative for any girl in that time and place. She worked in 3 different houses in the following years, sleeping in small rooms at the back of the courtyards, eating what was left over from other people's tables, and learning to occupy the least space possible, as if asking permission to exist was part of the routine. She learned to cook, iron, clean, and sew with a skill that honed itself because Fru Signy had already taught her the basics, and the rest came from necessity, which is the most impatient teacher there is. And in every house, with every small wage she received, Agneta did the same thing. She separated a part of it and kept it. No one knew about that money. No mistress, no colleague, no neighbor. Agneta kept the secret with the discipline of one who learned early that the things others know you have are the first things they try to take from you. She kept the banknotes folded in pieces of cloth that she rolled up and hid inside a dented tin peppercorn gingerbread box that she had carried at the bottom of her suitcase since she was 14. That box traveled with her from house to house, from mistress to mistress, from village to village, always at the bottom of the old leather suitcase that had belonged to her mother, always hidden under clothes, folded with the care of one who hides a treasure. And it was a treasure. Every coin in there represented a day when she had eaten less, bought less, lived with less, so that the future would have something. She did not yet know what she would do with that money, but she knew with a certainty that came from deep within her body that one day she would need it. Ragnar appeared when she was 22 years old. He worked as a timber driver's assistant, lived on the road, and had that loose way of someone who carries no weights on his shoulders, neither responsibilities, nor plans, nor remorse. He had an easy smile and a smooth talk that made Agneta laugh, something she rarely did, and which, precisely for this reason, had a value she could not calculate well. They were married in a simple town hall, with no party, no guests, with two unknown witnesses who were there for other business and agreed to sign out of politeness. Agneta thought she was starting a life. She did not know that she was merely trading one kind of loneliness for another. The early years were bearable in the way bad things are bearable when a person has no standard of comparison with what is good. Ragnar would be gone for weeks at a time for work, and when he returned, he was a partygoer, a spendthrift, the kind who arrived with a gift no one had asked for and without the rent money everyone needed. Agneta sewed for others. She mended clothes for the neighbors, washed and ironed when she found work, and with this she kept the house standing with her own hands, while Ragnar held his glass of Brennivin at the corner tavern. Every time he was in town, she continued to keep the tin box at the bottom of her suitcase. It continued to grow banknote after banknote, month after month, with the stubborn patience of someone who is building something that does not yet have a form. 8 years passed like this, in a marriage that emptied out from the inside like a fruit rotting without showing any external signs. Agneta stopped hoping for a change after the 5th year, stopped arguing after the 6th, stopped feeling anger after the 7th. In the 8th year, when she discovered she was pregnant, she felt something she had not felt for far too long and which she struggled to recognize. She felt that something finally was truly hers, that it was growing inside her own body, and that for the first time, no one could take it from her. She told Ragnar on a Tuesday evening when he had returned from a trip with wrinkled clothes and sour breath. He stared at her for a time that did not suit the news he had just received, as if he were calculating something that had nothing to do with any child. Then he said he had to think about it, that things were difficult, that perhaps it was not the time. Agneta did not answer. She already knew that Ragnar's silence was not that of someone who is thinking, but of someone who has already decided and lacks the courage to speak. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning, she woke up and his backpack was not in the corner of the living room. His clothes were not in the wardrobe. The bottle of Brennivin that sat on top of the refrigerator was gone. Ragnar had left at dawn without a sound, without a note, without a word, as if he had never lived there. Agneta sat on the edge of the bed for almost an hour with her hands on her belly that had just begun to grow, looking at the open wardrobe where only empty hangers remained, swaying slightly in the breeze from the window. She did not cry in that moment. The pain she felt was of a kind that comes before tears, deeper, heavier, like a root snapping underground where no one sees. What came next was worse than the abandonment. Agneta discovered that Ragnar had left behind 3 months of unpaid rent and a debt at the grocery store that she knew nothing about. The landlord showed up at the end of that week with an eviction notice under his arm and an expression on his face that mixed pity and impatience. She had 30 days to leave, almost 3 months pregnant, without a husband, without a family, without a steady job, with 30 days to dismantle a life that had already been dismantled for a long time. It was during that week, while she was packing away what she could in a house that was no longer hers, that Agneta overheard the conversation at Herr Elffane's tavern. 2 men were talking about a property for sale in the surrounding area. An old ruined croft that an outsider wanted to get rid of at any price, a place no one wanted because it was falling apart and was far from everything. Agneta stopped sweeping the sidewalk and stood listening without the men noticing. She memorized the name and the next day went to the notary's office to ask the price. It was low, truly, so low that Agneta checked twice to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. The property was located almost 30 kilometers from the town in an area of dirt roads, with no asphalt, no close neighbors, no electricity, nothing but the land, the ruined house, and a well that no one knew if it still gave water. The notary explained everything with that honesty that is sometimes confused with discouragement. He said the owner wanted to sell quickly, that he accepted the amount in cash, and that the deed would be ready the same day. Agneta listened, did the math in her head, and felt her heart beat with the force of those decisions that, as is known, will change everything, for better or worse, with no middle ground. She went home, pulled the suitcase from under the bed, opened the tin box, and counted the money she had spent 16 years saving. It was enough. It was exactly enough, with a remainder so small it barely bought 1 kilogram of rice. But it was enough. 3 days later, Agneta was in the notary's office with the money on the table and her belly touching the edge of the wood. She signed with her decisive handwriting, folded the deed carefully, put it in her dress pocket, and walked out the door without looking back. She was now 7 months pregnant, had a suitcase with everything she owned, a hat that protected her from the sun, and a ruined croft she didn't know, waiting for her at the end of a dirt road. She walked all day. Her swollen feet inside her boots protested at every kilometer. The baby moved with a restlessness that seemed to mirror its mother's, and the Nordic summer sun beat down mercilessly as it beats down on those who have no shade by choice. She stopped 3 times to rest on the side of the road, drinking water from a borrowed canteen that a woman from the neighboring village had given her without asking for anything in return. And at every stop, she put her hand in her dress pocket to feel the paper of the deed, as if she needed to confirm she hadn't been dreaming. The croft appeared when the sun was already low and orange, in that way the sunset has in the countryside. When everything takes on a color that seems fake, it is so beautiful. But the croft was not beautiful. The house had dry stone walls that were cracked, with the plaster falling off in patches that accumulated on the ground like old skin. The roof had collapsed in an entire corner, leaving the clay tiles piled on the ground among broken and blackened beams. Weeds had taken over everything, with a patient aggressiveness climbing the walls, entering through the glassless windows, covering what must once have been a yard. The front door was crooked on its hinges, held by a single hinge. Agneta stood still at the entrance for a time she could not measure, with her suitcase in her right hand and her left hand on her belly, looking at what she had bought with all her life's savings. It wasn't what she expected. It was worse, but it was hers. And that word hers had a weight she had never felt before. A weight that did not tire, that did not hurt, that did the opposite of what weights do. It lifted. Agneta dropped her suitcase on the dirt, pushed the door with her shoulder, and entered. The smell of mold and old wood filled her nostrils first. Then her eyes adjusted to the gloom, and the room revealed itself. A large space with an earthen floor, walls stained with dampness, and a natural skylight where the roof was missing, through which the late afternoon light entered. There was a cast-iron wood stove at the back, cracked but standing, and next to it a stone sink covered in dust. In the back room, a wooden straw tick without a mattress leaned against the wall, with a window overlooking the back where the weeds grew tall and thick. She walked slowly through the rooms, touching the walls with the palm of her hand, feeling the texture of the stone, looking for the solid points and the weak points. The kitchen wall was solid. The back room had a long crack that went from the ceiling halfway down the wall, but it was not structural. Frusigny would have said it was a settling crack, something that is resolved with new mortar and patience. Agneta returned to the back and stood looking at the land stretching behind the house, wide and covered with low and tall vegetation, without form, without order, without any sign that human hands had cared for it for many years. But the earth was there, dark where the weeds let it be seen, with that reddish tone that the rain brings to the surface when the soil is fertile underneath. Agneta knew nothing about agriculture. She didn't know how to recognize the type of soil, she didn't know when to sow, she didn't know the difference between hoeing and plowing, but she knew how to recognize one thing. She knew how to recognize a place that needed someone, and that croft needed her just as much as she needed it. The first night was long and full of sounds she didn't know. Crickets, owls, the wind beating on the loose roof tiles, the creaking of the old wood settling in the cold of the night. Agneta made a makeshift bed in the back room, using her clothes as a pillow, and lay down with her hand on her belly, looking at the ceiling where 2 tiles were missing. And the stars appeared, more stars than she had ever seen in her entire life, because there was no light there to compete with them. The baby moved slowly with that wave-like movement she already knew, and that always calmed her, as if the baby were telling her that it was there, that it hadn't left, that it was the only company Agneta needed in that moment. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath of the air that smelled of wild grass, wet earth, and open night. She didn't know how she would do it. She didn't know where to start. She didn't know if the well water was good, if the wood stove worked, if the roof would hold the next rain, if she would be able to put food on the table before the baby arrived. She knew almost nothing, but she knew one thing with the same certainty with which she knew her own name. She would not leave there. That land was hers, and she would learn everything necessary to make it bear fruit. The second day began before the sun. Not because Agneta had planned to wake up early, but because her body did not allow her to sleep longer. Her back complained about the hard wooden bed, her feet were still swollen from the walk the day before, and the baby seemed to have decided that dawn was the time to move with energy. She lay still for a few minutes, looking at the ceiling where the stars had given way to a blue that was slowly brightening, and then she got up, because lying down had never solved anything in her life, and it wasn't going to start now. The first thing was the well. Agneta walked out the back door, crossed the yard where the dew-soaked grass soaked the hem of her dress up to her knee, and found the stone structure covered by a lid of rotten boards. She carefully moved the boards, peeked inside, and stood listening. The echo came from below, that hollow sound of empty space ending in water. The well was not dry. There was an old rope tied to a wooden support next to it, with a tin bucket attached to the end, rusty but whole. Agneta lowered the bucket slowly, feeling the rope scratch her palms. And when she heard the sound of the tin hitting the water, she pulled it up with arms trembling from the effort and the expectation. The water came up clear, odorless, cold in a way that seemed impossible in the heat that was already beginning to announce itself, even with the sun still hidden. She drank with cupped hands and felt the cold slide down her throat, like an answer to a question she hadn't asked aloud, but which had been there since the night before. There was water, the croft had water, and water was the beginning of everything. Then she went into the yard to look for what the earth offered without anyone having asked for it. She found an old apple tree with a thick, twisted trunk in the left corner of the land, with ripe fruit fallen to the ground and others still hanging on the lowest branches. She picked 3 apples with her hands, feeling the warm skin from the previous day's sun that was still preserved in the fruit. She ate standing there in the yard, letting the juice run down her chin because there was no one to see her and because the hunger of one who hasn't eaten well for 2 days has no patience for good manners. It was during that morning that Agneta did what she knew how to do best. She worked. She started with the kitchen because survival passed through there first of all. She swept the dirt floor with a birch branch she tied with a piece of rope from the well, removing layers of dry leaves, dirt, and cobwebs that had accumulated over years of abandonment. She scrubbed the stone sink with handfuls of sand from the yard until the gray surface re-emerged from beneath the crust of dirt. The wood stove had a crack on the left side, but the main opening was intact and the combustion chamber seemed functional. Agneta found pieces of old wood stacked behind the house, separated the ones that were still dry from the rotten ones, and tried to light the fire. It took her almost an hour, with her eyes stinging from the smoke and her fingers sore from striking so many matches she had found in a glass jar inside a warped drawer of the kitchen cupboard. The wood resisted, damp on the inside, even though it looked dry on the outside. And Agneta almost gave up before remembering that her mother used to light the fire with dry birch bark underneath, which caught fire quickly and held the flame long enough for the wood to catch. There were no birch trees in the yard, but there were dry apple leaves scattered on the ground. It worked just the same. When the first smoke came straight out of the chimney and the fire stabilized inside the stove with that crackling that is the oldest sound of civilization, Agneta stood watching the flame with a satisfaction that did not fit the dimensions of what she had done. It was just a lit stove, but it was the first fire she was lighting in something that was hers, in a kitchen that was hers, on a floor that was hers. She boiled water in the only container she found, an iron pot without a lid that hung on a nail on the wall, and drank the hot, pure water without coffee, without sugar, without anything. Sitting on the threshold of the back door, looking at the yard that needed everything, her belly felt heavy, and the baby moved with that insistence of someone who was growing too big for the space. And Agneta placed her hand there and remained quiet for a while, feeling the baby's movements and thinking that in a few weeks she would have an extra mouth to feed and no source of food besides an apple tree and whatever the land decided to give her. It was on the 5th day that the visitor came to Agneta. She was in the yard trying to pull the weeds around the well with her hands because she hadn't found any tools in the croft, other than a rusty sickle with a loose handle that barely served to cut the grass, when she heard footsteps at the front of the property. They were firm, unhurried footsteps of someone walking on that land, like someone who knows every stone. Agneta stood up slowly, wiped her hands on her skirt, and walked toward the side of the house, with her heart tight. In that way, it tightens when you don't know if what is coming is help or a problem. A woman stood at the entrance to the property, looking at the house with an expression that mixed surprise with something that could be approval or curiosity or both together. She must have been in her 60s or more, maybe 70, with a face marked by the sun of a lifetime, white hair braided and gathered in a low bun, a dark dress of heavy cotton, and a woven birch bark basket on her arm that looked heavy. She had small, dark eyes that moved with the attention of a bird, registering everything without missing anything. The woman said her name was Gumanzera and that she lived in the nearest property, a little more than 2 kilometers along the path that cut through the forest. She said she had seen smoke over the last few days, and that smoke coming from an abandoned place is something that must be checked. She said all this with the objectivity of someone who doesn't need to beat around the bush to get to the point, looking at Agneta with that direct assessment that old country women do without any embarrassment, running her eyes from head to toe, lingering on the belly, and returning to her face. Agneta explained the situation with the same objectivity because she had no energy to embellish anything. She said she had bought the croft. Gumanzera listened to everything without interrupting, then set the basket down, took out a cloth bundle with barley flour, a piece of hard crisp bread, a small jar of butter, and a bunch of dandelion leaves tied with string. She placed everything on the stone sink in the kitchen with the naturalness of someone who is returning something that belongs to that place. And she said the flour was fresh, that the crisp bread was good for a pregnant woman's blood, and that the dandelion leaves were for the stomach. Gumanzara stayed for that entire morning. She walked around the croft with Agneta, examining the land with eyes that knew how to read the earth as other people read the pages of a book. She would crouch, pick up handfuls of dirt, rub them between her fingers, smell them, drop them, and go to another spot. She did this with a serious concentration that Agneta observed in silence, without understanding what was being evaluated, but understanding that it was important. In the backyard, where the weeds grew tallest and thickest, Gumanzera suddenly stopped and stood looking at the ground with a different expression. She pushed the grass aside with her foot and showed Agneta what was underneath. Stones lined up, forming the outline of what had once been gardens. An ancient vegetable patch, completely swallowed by the vegetation, but with the structure still visible to those who knew where to look. And in the midst of it all, insisting on existing without any human care, 2 wild potato plants had sprung up on their own from old tubers left in the soil from who knows how many years ago. Gumanzera pulled one of the plants with a firm tug and showed the root to Agneta. It was small, knobby, with dark skin and white flesh. The old woman said that was a sign that land that grows potatoes on its own is land that is begging to be cultivated. She said potatoes were the most generous plant that existed, that they grew where almost nothing else grew, that they fed people and animals, that they gave everything a person needed not to go hungry. She said these things with a restrained reverence, like someone speaking of something that deserves respect. And Agneta listened to every word with an attention that went beyond curiosity, because there lay the answer she needed. Potatoes were what she would plant. That was what she would learn. In the following days, Gumanzara returned. She returned the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, always from the path in the woods, always with the basket on her arm, always with something inside, broad bean seeds, chive seedlings, a handful of seed potatoes cut to the right size for planting, which she brought from her own garden, like someone lending a tool and not expecting it back. She taught with the patience of someone who knows that knowledge not passed on dies along with the one who possesses it. And Agneta learned with the hunger of someone who needs that knowledge to survive. The first lesson was preparing the earth. Gumanzera showed her how to use the sickle to cut the tall weeds, how to turn the soil with the hoe she herself had brought as a loan from home because the one at the croft was useless, how to clear the patches of stones and old roots, and how to recognize by the smell and color whether the soil needed rest or was ready to receive plants. The second lesson was the seed potatoes. Gumanzera cut the tubers and showed her how to bury them in the right position with the sprouts facing upward, spaced an arm's length apart. Agneta planted the first potatoes in a patch she had spent 3 days clearing, with her belly making every movement of crouching and standing difficult, with her back protesting and her knees complaining, but with a determination on her face that Gumanzera observed out of the corner of her eye without commenting, even though her expression said it all. They planted 32 potatoes in that first week, in a rectangular patch that occupied a small fraction of the yard. But to Agneta, it seemed as big as a promise. Gumanzera said the potatoes would be ready in a few months, depending on the variety and the rain, and that in the meantime, it was necessary to plant other things to eat day by day. Broad beans that grew quickly, turnips, cabbages that expanded on their own, dill, and chives to have some herbs, a survival garden that would feed the mother and child until the potatoes were ready. It was at the end of the second week that Gumanzera told her the story of the croft. They were sitting in the yard, Agneta resting with her back against the wall of the house, and Gumanzara preparing the cabbage seedlings. When the old woman said, with the voice of someone pulling out a thread of memory kept for a long time, that croft had been famous in the region. She said that many years ago, a mill operated there, which supplied 3 markets in the surroundings. The owner was a man named Herr Gustav, who made the best toasted potato flour in the region, dry and fine and toasted to just the right point, which no one else could match. The mill was located at the back of the property, where now there were only weeds and stones, and it was powered by a draft horse with a large brick roasting oven and a wooden press and millstone. Half the families in the region bought their flour from there. Then Herr Gustav died, and his children didn't want to stay. They went to the city, sold the property to a guy who never showed his face, and the croft was forgotten. The mill collapsed, and the forest swallowed everything. Gumanzera told this and then fell silent for a while, looking at the yard with those eyes that saw what was no longer there, and she said that the earth has memory, that soil knew how to make flour, and was waiting for someone to remember it. Agneta listened and kept that story in a deep place. Together with the money that no longer existed, together with the deed in her dress pocket, together with her mother's words about keeping everything that was hers. She said nothing, but something ignited inside, like the ember that slowly catches under the ash and whose heat only those nearby can feel. That same week, Agneta's belly reached the 8th month, and the weight changed everything. Her body, which already worked hard, started working double to do half, because every movement now required a calculation of balance that the belly did not facilitate. Crouching became an operation in stages, standing up an effort of arms and legs together, and carrying the bucket of water from the well to the kitchen became the most difficult task of the day. Gumanzera started coming earlier and staying later, bringing not only seedlings and seeds, but also raspberry leaf teas that she said were good for preparing the body for childbirth, and a mixture of dried herbs to make sitz baths that relieved the swelling of the legs. It was on one of those afternoons, while Gumanzera was showing her how to tie the bean vines to wooden stakes so they wouldn't fall in the wind, that Agneta asked her if she had been a midwife. The old woman smiled, a smile that was more in her eyes than on her lips, and said she had delivered more than 40 babies in that region, that she had started by helping her mother, who was a midwife before her, and that the last baby she had delivered was about 5 years ago. She said this with a simplicity that was the opposite of modesty. It was the tranquility of someone who knows what they know and doesn't need to prove it to anyone. Agneta felt a lump in her throat that was not from sadness, it was relief. That relief that comes when you discover that you will not have to face the scariest thing in life completely alone. She didn't ask if Gumanzera would be present at the birth. There was no need. The answer was already in the way. The old woman looked at her belly every time she arrived, checking its position, calculating the time, silently preparing for what was to come. But not everything was sewing and learning. In the 3rd week, as Agneta was returning from the well with the bucket of water balanced in her hand, she saw a man on horseback stopped in front of the croft, looking at the house with a familiarity that did not suit a visit. He was a large man with a prominent belly and a leather hat, riding a well-groomed animal that contrasted with everything around him. Beside him, a younger boy held a folder of documents under his arm. The man saw Agneta approaching and gave a wide smile that arrived before any words, one of those smiles that are more of a tool than a feeling. He said his name was Patron Leonard, that he was a landowner in the region and a merchant in the city, and that he had come to check the situation of the croft because he had heard someone was living there. He said all this while dismounting from his horse with the tranquility of someone entering his own land, and Agneta felt that tightness in her stomach that warns when something is wrong. Leonard walked around the land without asking permission, looking at the house, the yard, the vegetable patches that Agneta had cleaned, with an evaluation in his eyes that was not curiosity. It was calculation. Then he returned to where she stood, with the bucket still in her hand, and said, with the smile that hadn't left his face for a moment, that he knew that property well, that he had made an offer to buy it from the old owner more than once, and that he was surprised to learn that the land had been sold without him being consulted. He used the word consulted as if he had a natural right to that thing, and then added that there were certain issues with the documents of the croft that could complicate the situation for someone living there without proper regularization. Agneta set the bucket on the ground carefully and said, looking at him without breaking eye contact, that the property deed was in her name, registered by the notary, and that there was no irregularity. Leonard stopped smiling for a second, just a second, and in that interval, Agneta saw what lay behind the cordiality. Then the smile returned, and he said he hoped everything was in order. Truly, because it would be a shame if a woman in her situation had problems with the law, he mounted his horse and left with the boy with the folder, leaving a silence in the air that weighed more than a verbal threat. That night, Agneta did not sleep well. She lay on the straw tick with her hand on her belly and her eyes on the ceiling, thinking about Leonard's words and the smile that did not match any of them. She thought about the deed that was folded inside a closed glass jar she kept under a loose floorboard in the kitchen, along with the last coins remaining after the purchase. She wondered if the document was really in order, if the notary hadn't made mistakes, if there was some loophole that a man with money and influence could use to take away the only thing she had in the world. The baby moved forcefully, as if feeling the mother's agitation, and Agneta took a deep breath and did what she always did when fear gripped her. She thought of her mother. She thought of Fru Signy's hands wringing out clothes before dawn, day after day, year after year, without complaining, without stopping, without asking anything of anyone, and she thought of the last thing her mother had told her. Keep everything that is yours. Agneta closed her eyes and gripped her belly with both hands. That land was hers, the baby was hers, and no one, no man with a wide smile and a fine horse was going to take it from her without her using every drop of strength she had to prevent it. Gumanzera found out about Leonard before Agneta needed to tell her. She arrived via the path the following morning with the basket on her arm and an expression on her face different from usual, more closed, more attentive, like someone who has already put the puzzle together and didn't like the picture that came out. She said that the news that a pregnant woman was living in old Herr Gustav's croft had already spread throughout the region, and that Leonard had taken care to spread his own version, a version in which the purchase was doubtful, the documentation weak, and the occupation irregular. She said this while unloading the basket onto the kitchen sink with the same naturalness as always, as if she were commenting on the weather. But her eyes told another story. Agneta listened without interrupting, her hands on her belly and her feet planted on the dirt floor of the kitchen. And when Gumanzara finished, she asked only one thing. She asked if the deed she had registered at the notary was a document easily contested. Gumanzara looked at her for a moment and said no, that a deed registered by the notary with both parties present and payment in cash was a solid document, and that Leonard knew this better than anyone because he was a man who understood land and papers. What he was doing was not questioning the document, he was questioning the woman holding it in her hand. The following days brought that kind of pressure that does not manifest in shouts, but in whispers. Agneta began to notice small things that did not happen by chance. The access path to the croft, which was a dirt track through the vegetation, appeared one morning with large branches lying across it, as if someone had deliberately felled them to obstruct the way. The following week, a rumor arrived via a traveling salesman passing through the region, saying that the croft had document problems and that anyone buying anything produced there was getting into trouble. Gumanzara picked up these movements with the precision of someone who knows every gear of that community and reported them to Agneta with the controlled concern of someone who knows that too much worry paralyzes and too little kills. Agneta listened, registered it, and returned to the garden, because the garden did not wait for the resolution of any conflict, and the plants she had put in the earth needed water and care, regardless of what Leonard was plotting. It was at the end of the third week of her second month at the croft that Agneta decided to explore the back of the property, where the vegetation was thickest and where neither she nor Gumanzara had yet gone with enough attention. The old woman had mentioned that the mill was in that direction, but Agneta had neither the time nor the physical condition to tackle that section where the weeds grew chest high and the ground was uneven due to exposed stones and roots. That morning, however, she woke up with a different restlessness. a desire to see with her own eyes what remained of what Zara had described with such reverence. She took the sickle she had already repaired with a new handle tied with iron wire and slowly cleared the way, cutting the tall weeds with short strokes that her 8-month pregnant belly made clumsy. Sweat dripped off her before she had even advanced 10 meters, and the baby protested at every sudden movement with kicks that took her breath away. But Agneta continued, because inside her there was a stubbornness that did not obey exhaustion. What she found after almost an hour of work made her stop and stare in silence for a time she could not measure. The ruins of the mill were there, overgrown by vegetation, but recognizable to someone who knew what to look for. The brick roasting oven had partially collapsed, with one of the walls still standing, blackened by the soot of decades, thick and solid, as if waiting to be rebuilt. The wooden press had fallen to the side, with the main structure rotted, but with the iron screws still firmly in the stone base. There were the remains of a wooden trough where the roots were washed, covered in green moss and split in half, and nearby, half buried in the ground, a stone grinding wheel that served to grate the potatoes, heavy, round, and perfectly intact beneath the layer of dirt and leaves that time had deposited. Agneta ran her hand over the surface of the stone, feeling the grooves that some hand had carved many years before, with the exact purpose of transforming the crop into flour, and she felt something that was hard to explain. It was as if that place were waiting, not in a mystical or fanciful way, but in the practical way that things wait when they were made to outlast the people who built them. Zara came to see it the next day and stood before the ruins with an expression Agneta had never seen on her, a mix of nostalgia and satisfaction, like someone finding a relative after many years and discovering they are old but alive. The old woman walked among the remains with careful steps, touching the wall of the oven, examining the grinding wheel, testing with her foot the solidity of the base where the press had operated. Then she turned to Agneta and said with a firmer voice than usual that this thing could be rebuilt. Not immediately, not quickly, not easily, but it could. The grinding stone was whole. The base of the oven could support a reconstruction. And most importantly, the land around it was the same land that had produced Herr Gustav's crop, which made the best toasted flour of 3 markets. Agneta looked at the ruins and looked at her belly and thought she was crazy for thinking what she was thinking, but she thought it anyway and kept that thought in the same place where she kept everything that was important, deep down solid, where no one could reach. The 9th month arrived with the weight that the final months of pregnancy bring, that weight that is not only of the body, but of everything that is about to come, of the waiting, the fear, the anxiety mixed with a rush that the baby seems to share. Agneta could barely work in the garden, having to stop every few minutes to breathe and rest her hands on her lower back, which ached as if it were being squeezed from the inside. Her feet swelled from the first hour of the morning and did not go down even at night. Zara had started coming every day, now bringing specific herbal teas for every discomfort. Raspberry leaves for the uterus, lemon balm for anxiety, lemongrass for pain, and checking the baby's position with the expert hands that had welcomed more than 40 children into that world. She said everything was fine, that the baby was turned head down as it should be, that it was a matter of days. She said this now with the tranquility of someone who knows that tranquility is the thing a mother most needs to hear in that moment. And Agneta clung to that calm like a rope in a flooding river. The garden was already showing its results. The broad beans had sprouted with a speed that seemed impossible, covering the stakes with green vines and small flowers that promised pods in a few weeks. The chives and dill formed dense tufts in the stone-lined beds that Agneta had cleared with her own hands, and the cabbages spread over the ground with a lazy generosity that covered more soil every day. But it was toward the potato patch that Agneta looked most often, toward the plants that had sprouted with green leaves spread open like hands reaching for the sun. Each one a promise of a tuber growing underground, invisible, patient, doing the work the earth does when someone takes proper care of it. Zara said the plants were beautiful, that the spacing was good, and that the earth was responding. And every time she said it, Agneta felt that ember that had caught in the mill ruins grow a little hotter. The night of the birth arrived without warning, as births do. Agneta was in the kitchen washing the few dishes she had when she felt the first pain, different from all the other pains the pregnancy had brought her. It was lower, deeper, like a squeeze coming from a place she couldn't name, rising in waves until it took her breath away. She left the dish in the sink, gripped the edge with both hands, and waited for the wave to pass. When it passed, she stood still for a moment, feeling her whole body on alert, every muscle tense, every sense sharpened, as if her entire organism had received a warning that her mind was still processing. The second pain arrived 15 minutes later with the same intensity, and Agneta knew she did what Gunman Zara had instructed her. She lit the kerosene lamp the old woman had brought her the week before, specifically for that night. She put water to boil on the wood stove, which already had embers from earlier, and went to the back door, where she hung a white cloth on the pole of the laundry line. It was the agreed signal. If Gunman Zara saw the cloth at night, it meant it was time. Gunman Zara arrived before midnight via the path in the woods, with a lantern in her hand and the basket full of clean cloths, scissors, string, and a small bottle of castor oil she used to massage the belly during labor. She entered the croft with the calm of someone arriving to do the job she knows how to do. She checked the boiling water. She prepared the back room with the cloth spread on the straw bed and the things organized in the order she needed them. Agneta was sitting on the yard bench when she arrived, breathing deeply between contractions that were now getting closer, with her hands gripping the wood and her face bathed in sweat. Gunman Zara sat next to her, placed a hand on her back, and sat there in silence, simply present, simply solid. With that solidity of someone who has been through it so many times, she knows that the best thing a midwife can offer before any technique is the certainty that no one will face that thing alone. The birth lasted all night. The hours dragged on between waves of pain that grew in intensity and intervals that shortened without mercy. And Agneta went through each one of them the way women go through them, with an instinct that comes from a place older than any learning. Holding on, breathing, moaning when her body told her to moan, and falling silent when her body told her to be silent. Gunman Zara guided everything with her hands and her voice, telling her when to push and when to rest, checking the position, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth, and repeating with the regularity of someone praying that everything was going well, that the baby was arriving the right way, that there was little left. There was a moment, in the darkest hours of the night, when Agneta squeezed Gunman Zara's hand with a strength born of desperation and said she couldn't do it. The old woman squeezed back with the same strength and said, looking her in the eyes, that she would do it, yes, because she was already doing it, and that the hardest part of anything in life is believing you can do it when your body says no. Agneta closed her eyes, breathed the air that smelled of kerosene, sweat, and herbs, and pushed. The cry tore through the silence of the night with a force that did not match the size of the one crying. It was a sharp, angry sound, like a protest and a celebration at the same time, and it filled the room, the house, the yard, and the entire night with the news that someone new had arrived in the world. Gunman Zara took the baby girl with hands that knew exactly what to do. She cut the cord with the scissors she had sterilized in boiling water, cleaned the small body with a warm cloth, and wrapped her with the care of someone holding the most important thing that exists. Then she placed the baby in Agneta's arms, who received that tiny weight with a delicacy that contrasted with everything she had done in the past few months. All the hard work, all the turned earth, all the sickle, the hoe, and the bucket of water carried on her head. Now she was just a woman holding her daughter for the first time, with eyes full of a water that was neither of sadness nor pain. It was of something else, something she had never felt before, and which she knew she would not be able to explain to anyone for the rest of her life. The baby girl had dark eyes that couldn't see well yet, but which opened for an instant, as if to register her mother's face before going back to sleep. Aurora, Agneta said the name quietly, her voice hoarse from the effort. She had chosen that name weeks before without telling anyone, because giving a name before the time had always seemed like a risk she couldn't take, but now she said it, and the name fit as if it had been tailor-made, because Aurora was born at the exact moment the first light of day was entering through the bedroom window, bringing with it that timid clarity that comes before the actual sun. That promise that darkness is never the final word. Gunman Zara stood nearby with her arms crossed, and a smile on her lips that was a mix of exhaustion and victory, looking at the two with the profound satisfaction of someone who has just done the most important thing she knew how to do in the world. She said the girl was strong, that she had good lungs, and that she would give her a hard time. And she said it as a compliment because in Gummin, Zara's conception, a child who gives you a hard time is a child who has come to stay. The weeks after Aurora's birth were the hardest and fullest Agneta had ever lived. Her body demanded a rest that she couldn't fully grant herself because the garden didn't stop growing and needed constant attention, and the baby didn't stop nursing and needed even greater attention. Agneta tied Aurora to her chest with a wide cloth, as Gummin Zara had taught her the way country women have always carried their children. Firm and close to the body, she went to work in the garden with the baby sleeping to the sound of her mother's movements. She hoed with the baby on her chest, watered with the baby on her chest, harvested the first bean pods with the baby on her chest, and every time the baby woke up and cried, Agneta stopped, sat in the shade of the apple tree, nursed her, and then returned to where she had left off, without complaining, without regrets, without stopping. Gummin Zara showed up every day and watched that scene with an expression that softened over time, as if she were seeing something she needed to see to believe. The broad beans bore fruit first. The pods filled the stakes with green, then yellowed and dried on the plant. And when Agneta harvested the first ones with her hands, she felt the light weight of those beans inside the shell with an emotion that seemed disproportionate for someone holding a handful of beans, but it wasn't disproportionate. It was the first food she had produced with her own hands, taken from a land that was hers, from a seed she had planted. And this had a meaning that went far beyond the hunger those beans would satisfy. It was proof that she could do it, that the earth responded, that the plan that seemed like madness 2 months before was bearing fruit in the most literal sense there is. She cooked the beans that same evening on the wood stove with the chives and dill that were also from the garden. And the smell that filled the kitchen was the smell of something priceless, because it was the smell of sufficiency, of someone who no longer depends on anyone to eat. Patron Leonard returned when Aurora was 3 weeks old. He arrived on horseback like the other time, but without the boy with the folder and without the smile. He stopped at the entrance of the property and stood looking at the house, which now had baby clothes hanging to dry. Smoke was coming from the chimney, and a green vegetable garden was visible from the path. Agneta was on the porch with Aurora in her arms when she saw him and felt her stomach tighten with that bad familiarity the body develops when it recognizes a threat from before. Leonard dismounted, stood holding the horse, looking down at her, and said with a voice that had lost all the cordiality of the previous visits that the situation had changed. He had hired a lawyer to verify the documentation of the purchase, and there were indications of irregularities that could annul the deed. He said he was giving her the chance to leave on her own accord before things got ugly, and that a lone woman with a newborn should think better before picking a fight she had no way of winning. Agneta stared at him with Aurora sleeping in her lap, feeling the weight of the girl against her chest and the weight of those words against everything she had built in recent months. She didn't answer immediately. She remained silent for a while. It bothered Leonard more than any answer would have, because a woman's silence that doesn't lower its gaze is a kind of confrontation that men like him don't know how to handle. She said in a low, firm voice that the deed was in order, that she knew it and he knew it too, and that if he had any lawyer's paper to show, he should show it. But until he showed it, she was going to stay exactly where she was, planting the land that was hers and raising the daughter that was hers. Leonard tightened the horse's reins with such force he made the animal step back and said she would regret it. Then he turned the horse and left down the dirt road, kicking up dust that took a long time to settle, as threats do when they don't find the fear they expected to find. That night, after putting Aurora to sleep in the woven birch bark basket that Gummin Zara had made, Agneta went out into the yard and stood looking at the sky full of stars, with her arms crossed and her thoughts in motion. She thought of Leonard and the threat he represented. She thought of the deed under the floorboard. She thought of the potatoes that were growing invisibly underground with the patience she needed to learn to have. She thought of the ruins of the mill at the back of the property, of the intact stone wheel, of the oven that could be rebuilt, of Herr Gustav's toasted potato flour, which had been the best of 3 markets, and she made her decision. That night, standing in the yard, with the smell of earth and lemongrass in the air and the sound of crickets filling the silence, she wasn't just going to plant potatoes to survive. She was going to rebuild the mill. She was going to make toasted potato flour. She was going to sell it at the market. She was going to transform that ruined croft into what it had once been and what it could be again. And Leonard, with all his money and his lawyers and his smiles turned into threats, would have to swallow every word he had said. Because Agneta hadn't walked out of a lifetime of invisibility to accept being erased again. Are you rooting for Agneta? Can she protect what she built? Leave your like now and share this story with those who also believe in new beginnings. The reconstruction of the mill started the month after Aurora's birth and took the time that serious things take when they are done by hands that are in no hurry to make mistakes. Agneta started with what she could do alone, clearing the weeds that covered the ruins, unearthing the stone wheel with the hoe and her arms. And stubbornness was already her trademark, separating the loose stones into organized piles according to size and condition. She worked during the hours when Aurora slept, with the birch bark basket always nearby, under the shade of a tree, and she ran back when the baby cried. She nursed, calmed her down, and went back to the stones and the dirt, as if she were building two things at the same time, a mill and a daughter. Gumanzera observed this with an attention that went beyond curiosity, and one morning she appeared accompanied by a quiet man of about 50, thin and sunburned, whom she introduced simply as Mester Callie, a mason by trade and her old friend of many years. She said he had come to see the state of the roasting oven and evaluate what needed to be done. She didn't ask if Agneta wanted help, she simply brought the help. The same way she brought the flour and the seedlings, like someone returning to the world something that belongs to it. Mester Callie examined the ruins with the technical eye of someone who has worked with clay and stone since he was a boy. He tapped the walls, measured the angles with his eyes, and said few words. Because he was a man of few words. But what he said was enough. The oven could be rebuilt on the base that already existed, which was of good, well-laid stone. The press needed to be made new, but the fitting structure in the stone base was intact. The grinding wheel needed nothing. It was solid stone that would last another 100 years without complaining. He needed clay, he needed bricks for the oven, he needed wood for the press and the roof, and he needed muscle. Agneta listened to every word with that attention she dedicated to everything that meant the difference between succeeding and failing. And she said she didn't have money to pay for materials or labor. Mester Callie looked at Gumanzera. Gumanzera looked at him, and there was a silent communication between the two that belonged to a friendship of decades. The mason said that clay could be dug from the clay pit less than a kilometer away, that he knew a fellow who had leftover reclaimed wood, and that the bricks could be made right there in the yard if someone had the patience to cut and fire them. He didn't mention payment. Agneta understood what was being offered and felt that lump in her throat that came every time someone did something for her without asking for anything. Because her whole life had taught her that everything has a price, and unlearning that took an effort that hurt, it was so good. The work on the mill took 3 months. Mester Callie came on the days he could, always quiet, always efficient, raising the walls of the roasting oven with a care that transformed clay and brick into a solid structure. Gumanzera helped where her age allowed and commanded where her experience demanded, saying where the oven mouth should be, where the chimney needed to be for the smoke to exit right, how the wooden washing trough should be slanted so the water would drain without waste. Agneta did everything else. She carried clay, mixed mortar, cut wood with the sickle she had already learned to handle, with a skill that surprised even herself. And between one task and another, she ran to Aurora, who grew with the stubborn speed of babies, already rolling in the basket, already trying to grab everything that passed near her small hands. There were days when Agneta worked until dark and nursed Aurora under the light of the lantern, her arms aching from carrying stones and her whole body begging for a bed she only found after midnight. Every wall that went up, every layer of clay that dried, every piece of wood that fit together was a piece of that decision she had made in the yard under the stars, becoming more real. While the mill was taking shape, the potatoes in the patch completed their months of growth, with the patience only the earth knows how to have. Agneta checked the plants every morning, observing the leaves, the color, the vigor of the stems, applying everything Zara taught about the signs a plant gives when it's healthy and the signs it gives when something is wrong. The old woman said that potatoes talk to those who know how to listen. Leaves yellowing at the tip is lack of water. Stems too thin means weak soil. If the root takes time, the root comes thick. Agneta learned to listen, learned to read the earth, as she had learned to read the hands of her mistresses when she was a maid. With that attention of someone who needs to understand what is not said to survive, and the potatoes responded. The vines grew strong and open, covering the patch in green, and beneath the invisible earth, the real work happened, with a slowness that tested patience but rewarded faith. The first harvest happened when Aurora was 6 months old and could already sit up alone in her basket, waving her hands in the air with that motiveless joy that babies have and that infects anyone nearby. Zara came that morning with the face of someone who knew the day was important, and she stood next to the patch while Agneta plunged her hands into the earth and pulled the first plant. The root came up with the sound of breaking earth, thick, heavy, covered in dark soil, with the brown skin and white flesh showing where the skin had chipped in the effort of pulling. Agneta stood holding that potato plant with both hands, looking at it with an expression that Zara recognized, because it was the same expression women had when they held their child for the first time. That awe before something you made exist and that is now there, real, heavy, alive. They pulled 38 plants that morning, and the potatoes filled 3 woven baskets lined up on the porch like trophies of a silent war. The mill was finished a week after the first harvest, as if time had adjusted things so that one thing met the other at the right moment. The new clay oven was solid and smooth, with the mouth facing the wind as Zara had directed so the embers would catch evenly. The wooden press that Mr. Callie had built worked with a screw system that squeezed the grated mass with firm and constant pressure. The washing trough was slanted at the angle that made the water drain, carrying away the bitter liquid and leaving the pure starch to settle at the bottom. And the stone wheel, the very wheel of Herr Gustav, was mounted on a new hardwood support ready to grate the potatoes, just as it had grated decades ago. Agneta stood at the entrance of the mill on the day it was finished, with Aurora in her arms and the smell of fresh clay and wood in the air, looking at what 3 months ago was weeds and stone and ruin, and now was a functional structure built with her own hands and with the hands of people who had chosen to help without anyone forcing them. Zara stood beside her with her arms crossed and that smile that was more in her eyes than on her mouth. Mr. Callie leaned against the wall with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done a job well and doesn't need anyone to say it to know it. The first batch of flour happened on a Saturday morning, starting before dawn. Agneta peeled the potatoes the night before by the light of the lantern with the knife that Zara had sharpened on a stone until the edge cut almost by itself. She washed the roots in the trough with well water and grated them on the stone wheel, which turned heavy and firm, transforming the white flesh into a damp mass that smelled of earth and vegetable. She pressed the mass until the dark water drained down the channel and the starch settled at the bottom of the trough like powdered snow. Then she took the dried mass to the oven that Mr. Callie had lit in the early hours and which was exactly at the right point, with the clay slab radiating an even heat that dried without burning. Agneta stirred the flour with a wooden paddle that Zara had made especially for that, in a steady, circular motion that the old woman demonstrated, holding her hand and guiding the rhythm. She said the secret to good flour was patience at the oven, that whoever rushed burned it, and whoever was careless let it clump. And that the right point was when the grains became loose and dry and made the sound of fine rain when falling back onto the slab. The toasted potato flour was ready mid-morning. Agneta took it out of the oven and spread it on a woven straw mat to cool. And when it cooled, she took a handful and let it run through her fingers. It was fine, dry, of that pale golden tone that Zara said was the right tone. The tone that Herr Gustav's flour had, and no one in the region could match. Agneta brought a little to her mouth and tasted it. It was both simple and full. The flavor of perfectly toasted root with a light crunch that melted on the tongue and left an aftertaste. Zara tasted it and was silent for a moment that was longer than normal, chewing slowly with her eyes closed, and her expression was that of someone comparing it with a very old memory. Then she opened her eyes, looked at Agneta, and said it was identical. That was the flower the earth had remembered. Agneta didn't answer. She was too busy trying not to cry over a handful of toasted flour, which would be a difficult thing to explain to anyone who didn't understand what that handful represented. The first time at the market was the following week. Agneta filled 4 cloth sacks with flour, tied them to the back of a fjord horse that Mr. Callie lent her, and walked the 15 kilometers to the town with Aurora tied to her chest and her heart beating with an anxiety she hadn't felt since the day at the notary. She arrived at the market at dawn, set up a makeshift table with a crate a neighboring vendor lent her, and displayed the sacks of flour with a care that seemed disproportionate for someone selling flour and not jewelry. The first hours were silent. No one stopped, no one looked. Agneta stood there with Aurora in her arms, watching the other vendors sell and talk and negotiate, while her flour sat idle in the sacks as if it were invisible. She felt that old ghost of invisibility return with a force that almost knocked her down. But it didn't knock her down, because at that moment a woman stopped in front of the table, looked at the flour, and asked where it was from. Agneta said it was toasted potato flour from her croft, made in her own mill, toasted in a clay oven. The woman took a handful, smelled it, tasted it, and fell quiet for a second. Then she bought a whole kilo and said she would return the following week. She returned and brought her neighbor, and the neighbor brought her friend, and the friend told the owner of the boarding house, who sent her son to buy 2 kilograms at the next market. Agneta's flour had a quality that people recognized after the first taste. That fine and dry texture that didn't clump in the stew and didn't taste bitter in the porridge. That stayed crunchy and released a toasted aroma that filled the kitchen of whoever opened the sack. In 2 months, Agneta was selling her entire production before noon. In 4 months, people were placing orders for the following week. In 6 months, the owners of 2 grocery stores in the city sought her out to buy in quantity, and Agneta began to supply them regularly, with money coming in a flow she had never known in her life. Small still, but constant, predictable. Patron Leonard heard about the success before Agneta could imagine, because Leonard knew everything that happened in that region, and what he didn't know, he invented. He showed up at the croft on a Tuesday morning, this time on foot, without a horse, without a companion, with an expression on his face that was different from all previous ones. It was no longer the calculated smile of the first visit, nor the threatening coldness of the second, nor the aggressiveness of the third. It was something more like defeat disguised as cordiality. He said he had come to propose an agreement, that he was willing to buy all the flour Agneta produced for a fixed price, and he would resell it under his store's brand. He said it was an opportunity, that she would have a guaranteed purchase and wouldn't have to go to the market every week with a borrowed horse. Agneta was sitting on the porch peeling potatoes when he said all this, with Aurora sitting on the floor nearby playing with a wooden doll. She listened to him without stopping her peeling, without raising her head, without giving him the attention he was used to receiving. When Leonard finished, she said no. She said her flour went to the market with her name, that the customers knew her by name, and that was how it was going to continue. Leonard stood still for a moment, hands in his pockets and jaw clenched, sizing up that woman. He had tried to scare, pressure, threaten, and buy her. And not once had she moved a single centimeter from her spot. He walked away without another word. Agneta continued peeling potatoes with the same rhythm as before, as if nothing had happened, although inside, something was smiling. The following months brought what months bring when life finally decides to move forward. The potato field grew to 3 times its original size, occupying almost all the backland that Agneta had cleared inch by inch. The mill operated every week now, with the oven lit from dawn, and the smell of toasted flour spread through the forest and reached Gamanzero's path. The survival garden had become a garden of abundance, with broad beans, corn, cabbage, turnips, dill, and chives feeding the table, with enough left over to trade at the market for things the land didn't yield: sugar, salt, kerosene, fabric. The house received repairs that went beyond the necessary and entered the territory of the beautiful. Because Agneta had discovered that doing things with care took the same effort as doing them poorly, and that the result fed a part of her that pure survival could not reach. She plastered the walls with a mixture of clay and lime that Gamanzera taught her, and they became smooth and bright. She painted the facade with whitewash she bought in town with the flour money, applying 3 coats with a horsehair brush that Mr. Callie made for her. She sewed curtains for the windows with floral chintz fabric bought at the market, colorful and bright. It gave the house an air of life that contrasted with the ruin it had been less than a year before. Aurora took her first steps in the yard of the croft, between the vegetable beds, holding Gumanzera's hand on one side and nothing on the other. Because she let go of Agnetta's hand before her mother was ready to let go, and she walked the last 3 steps alone until she fell, sitting in the dirt with an expression of astonishment that made the 3 women laugh in a way that filled the yard with a sound that place hadn't heard in many years. The girl grew with a fierce curiosity for everything that was earth, plant, and animal, sticking her hands into the potato mash when Agnetta wasn't looking, eating dirt from the garden patch with the satisfaction of someone tasting the best candy in the world, chasing the chickens that Gumanzera had given them as a gift and that now scratched around the yard with the authority of those who have always lived there. Agnetta looked at her daughter and saw in her something she had never seen in herself as a child. The freedom to occupy space without asking permission, to be noisy and dirty and curious and present without anyone making her feel like a burden. And that was perhaps the most important thing she was building on that croft. More important than the flower, more important than the house, more important than anything that could be measured in kilos or in money. The fame of Agnetta's flower grew with the same steadiness that the potatoes grew underground, slowly, firmly, without fanfare. A year after the first batch, she was already supplying 5 grocery stores and 2 boarding houses in the region. And at the Wednesday market, she had a fixed spot that the other vendors respected without her needing to ask. People came from afar to buy, and they took not only the flower, but the story. Because in the countryside, things are sold like that, along with the one who made them, and Agnetta's story was already known throughout the area. The woman who had arrived pregnant and alone at a ruined croft and had made the earth yield the best flour tasted in many leagues. Gumanzera watched this with the satisfaction of someone who planted a seed knowing exactly what would grow. And when someone asked if Agnetta's flour was as good as old Herr Gustav's, the old woman would reply that it was better because it had something in it that Gustav didn't have. It had the hunger of someone who had to learn in order to survive. And that hunger gives a seasoning that cannot be taught. 2 years after arriving at the croft, on a Friday afternoon when Agnetta was in the mill roasting the second batch of the week, with Aurora sitting on a little stool beside her, imitating her mother's movements with a toy paddle that Mester Callie had made for her, a man appeared at the entrance to the property. Agnetta didn't see him arrive because her back was to the path, focused on the oven. It was Aurora who saw him first, and she stared at that stranger with the healthy suspicion that country children develop around people they don't know. The man was thinner than he should have been, with wrinkled clothes from someone who walked a lot and slept little, a worn hat in his hand, and his eyes scanning the croft with an expression that mixed astonishment with something that could be shame or regret, or both weighing together. Agnetta turned around when she heard Aurora make a sound of unfamiliarity and saw Ragnar standing there in the middle of the land she had cleared, next to the garden she had planted, in front of the house she had rebuilt. Looking at all of it with the face of someone who recognizes they are standing before concrete proof of everything they had underestimated. He stood there without approaching, twisting his hat in his hands like someone who doesn't know what to do with them. And he said he had heard about the croft and the flower and had come to see. He didn't say he had come to ask for forgiveness, nor if he wanted to come back, although both things were written on his face with a clarity that made the words unnecessary. Agnetta wiped her hands on her apron, stepped out of the mill, and walked over to where he was. She stood looking at that man who had left at dawn with a backpack and without a word, who had left behind a pregnant wife and debts that weren't hers, who had disappeared into the world with the ease of someone who never had roots anywhere. She saw the new weariness on his face, the worn clothes, the shoes with holes. She saw the man he was, and she saw the man he had always been, and she understood with the clarity that only time and pain teach. That anger was no longer what she felt. It wasn't forgiveness either. Because forgiveness is something that takes time to ripen and cannot be harvested before its time. It was something else. It was the calm realization that she had built all of that without him, and his presence there neither added to nor subtracted from what existed. Agnetta told Ragnar he could see his daughter if he wanted to, because Aurora had the right to see her father at least once, and that afterward he was to leave. She didn't say it with anger or with coldness. She said it with the firmness of someone who has already decided and has no room for negotiation. Ragnar looked at Aurora, who stood at the door of the mill with the toy paddle in her hand, and stared for a time that seemed longer than it was. Then he looked at Agneta, looked at the entire croft, at the White House with chintz curtains, at the green garden, at the potato field that stretched to the back, at the mill with smoke coming out of the chimney. And he said, with the low voice of someone speaking more to himself than to others, that she had done something he would never be able to do. Agneta didn't answer, because she didn't need to. The answer was, in every wall raised, in every bed planted, in every sack of flour that left that croft bearing her name. Ragnar stayed for a few minutes, looked at Aurora one last time, and walked away down the dirt road. In the exact same way he had walked away from that other house 2 years before, only this time the one left standing was Agneta, and the gate didn't slam shut behind anyone. That night, after putting Aurora to sleep, Agneta went out to the porch with a mug of coffee and sat on the bench that Mester Callie had made from hardwood, firm and smooth and wide enough for 2 people, even though she was sitting there alone, and that was no longer a problem. She looked at the moonlit yard, at the old apple tree that continued to bear fruit with the generosity of things that ask for nothing in return, at the garden beds where the broad beans and the corn and the cabbage grew in order and abundance, at the potato field that stretched as far as the eye could see under the light of the moon, and at the mill in the back, with the oven still warm from the day's batch, the stone wheel of Herr Gustav mounted on the new support, and the chimney pointing toward the sky full of stars. She thought of her mother wringing clothes before dawn. She thought of the biscuit tin she had carried at the bottom of her suitcase for 16 years. She thought of the morning at the notary's, with her hands trembling and her belly touching the edge of the table. She thought of the first night on the bed without a mattress, looking at the stars through the hole in the roof. She thought of Gum and Zara arriving along the path with the basket on her arm and the knowledge of a lifetime to share. She thought of Aurora taking her first steps among the garden beds, letting go of her hand and going alone, without fear, without asking permission, occupying the world with the confidence of someone who was born in a place that belongs to her, and she understood. Sitting there on that bench, with the coffee cooling in her hand and the smell of earth and lemongrass and toasted flour mixed in the night air, her mother had been right. Keep everything. Agneta had kept it. She had kept every coin, every lesson, every pain, every strength, every piece of herself that life had tried to take away. And now she sat there on the porch of a house that was hers, looking at a land that was hers, knowing that the daughter sleeping inside was going to grow up without ever needing to learn to be invisible. Hands that didn't know how to plant and learned to make sprout what nobody believed in. Women who carried the weight of the world in their bellies and their hearts and still made the earth bear fruit. Agneta wasn't born knowing how to cultivate. She was born knowing not to give up. And perhaps that is what separates those who survive from those who bloom. It is not the knowing, it is the stubbornness to learn. If this story touched something inside you, share it with those who need to hear it. That the driest earth still harbors a seed. That the most tired hands can still harvest. And that starting over is not going back to the beginning. It is starting from a place that only those who have lost everything manage to find. Until the next tale.